As with all things, nothing is ever perfect. There are pros and there are cons to working remotely. So let's take a look at what some of those pros are first.
Finding talent where they live.
Now, this is something that we discovered a long time ago. It's really hard to find talent where you are, especially if you're in a suburb somewhere or if you're in a city that doesn't really specialize in what your company does. You may have a very hard time finding good talent. And I remember when we started doing that, it was painful. We didn't want to give up that control of having people in-house, that we knew what they were doing. We had a good feel for what they could do and the skill sets that they had. We couldn't do that. We had to go find people elsewhere because in our particular city, there weren't a lot of programmers. There weren't a lot of people who worked in the IT field, which is what we specialized in those days. What did we do? We had no choice but to work remotely and find people. And that worked out really well. That was a real good pro for us, though there are cons to that too, as you'll see soon.
Next pro is flexible work hours for some.
Yeah, this doesn't work for everybody. Not everybody can do flexible work hours because it can be abusive. But in some cases, it makes it very easy to start your day, depending on the work you do, anytime you want, or to finish your day when you can. Maybe you have to pick up kids, you have to do things. So these are all things that can help when you're working remotely.
Reduced costs.
Now, this is a real good one there. If somebody's commuting to work very far, sometimes companies pay for that commuting expense. Not always, but sometimes they do. You're also reducing the cost of wear and tear on your vehicles, on commuting, on taking planes, on doing a lot of things. You don't have to do that much of. That saves you a lot of money. You also don't have to deal with that morning commute, which is usually when the most traffic is. You spend a lot of times in cars, trains, whatever, subways, whatever method you commute in, buses. It can be bad. So this saves you time, money, and frankly, expenses.
Remove commuting times,
which we just talked about.
Smaller corporate office requirements.
If you're a large company, and let's say you have a campus with 5 buildings and a lot of employees there, well, you won't need all that space if all of a sudden you go remote. Many companies in 2020 in particular got rid of large call centers and big office spaces because they embraced the working from home. Was it easy? No. Was it costly? Oh yeah. The thing is, it was costly for a while. Now they've reduced a lot of the overhead expenses. Office space can be very, very expensive. And when you're a large corporation, you're paying a premium for office space. 1, because you can, and 2, because most corporations want to look good. So many companies have decided to pare it down, bring it down, so they don't need the amount of space they needed before. Good thing in some cases, bad sometimes. But the thing is, it does, in the long and short run, cut costs quite a bit.
Our last pro on this list is better for parents and kids.
This is a mixed one. It is better for a lot of parents and kids because they get to see their kids more, and they get to work with their kids more too. On the other hand, we'll talk about some other things that could happen with the cons.
Our first con is not everyone can work remotely.
And this is true. Not everyone can work remotely. You have to have a certain personality type that doesn't mind working remotely, that doesn't miss all the people around them at all times. You can still meet with people via digital methods, conference calls, whatever you're doing, but it's not the same as being next to someone, working with them, feeling who they are, what they are, getting to know somebody more intimately. That goes away with remote working. It's not as easy. Now, while some people prefer remote working, there are some who don't do as well, or they're not disciplined enough. And that's another issue with remote workers. You have to have the discipline to be there when people expect you there. Because if you're not there and people keep looking for you, after a while they'll stop looking. And that means you won't be needed to be found anymore. Think about that.
Next, remote workers or managers disappear.
We talked a little bit about that a couple seconds ago. When people disappear, so do their jobs. People get fed up. If you're not around at all times, when somebody calls you during work hours, when you're supposed to be around, after a while, people will get tired of looking for you, and you will be looking for another job. That's just a reality of life. You have to be disciplined. Otherwise, you probably won't last in that remote environment very long.
Technology issues can affect workflows.
Having a computer, having great bandwidth, while wonderful, may not always be reliable. Depending on where you live, depending on the conditions of the internet in your area, or other things, including laptops that maybe your company has given you, your own computers, other things, a kid that got onto your computer and destroyed it. These are all things that happen. Technology, while a wonderful asset, can get in your way. You have to be careful of how you use it, and you have to respect the equipment you have, because, believe me, things break. And when they break, that costs money to replace, and at some point it may cost more than what your job may be worth. Keep that in mind.
Communication breakdowns.
Now, this is a very important part of being a remote worker. You must communicate. And this is a two-way street. It's not just for the workers, it is also for the managers. You cannot not communicate. You must communicate. It's very important, because without communication, remotely, things break apart and break down pretty quickly. You need to make sure that you're more proactive than you've ever been. Managers and employees or workers, you have to be proactive. Or remote probably won't work very well in the long run, maybe even in the short run.
Family and kids interrupt work.
Who ever heard of a kid saying, "Mommy, Daddy, Mommy, Daddy," 450 times, or you're trying to go on a conference call? Child, keep the door closed. Don't knock. Knock on the door before you come in. Dun 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 dun. Excuse me, I need to get off of this phone call. And I say, I'll be right back. Yes, what do you want? Mommy, Daddy, I want to go bathroom. You just went to the bathroom. I don't want to go again. These are things that happen all the time. When I first started working remotely, before we really built our company up, we had about a 2-year-old who decided, I want to bother you every 2 seconds. And they did. And I know a lot of other people in the same situation. If you don't have somebody watching the child and you're the only one, be prepared for some issues. And these issues could wind up in you losing your job. And that's a sad reality. But the kids can interfere. So can dogs. So can pets, animals, whatever. You have to separate, to a certain degree, your work life from your family life when it interferes with work. It's a reality of life. If your kids are screaming in the background and you're, let's say, a call service worker or a support worker in a call center, the clients may not like that. They may complain that they could not hear what you were saying, or this kid's a brat. That looks bad on the company. So these are things that are very negative to a company. I know people who worked in sales departments or call centers who got fired because their kids could not be controlled, or their animals would not stop barking or screaming or whatever they do. These are issues, something to consider.
Need for more travel sometimes.
There are times that working remotely may cause a need for more travel, and that's because you're not getting your work done. They may ask you to fly more and more. They may ask you to come into the office more, or they won't. This can be a real problem. If you really need to be in the office at all times, when you don't need to be there, it could cause issues. It could make it difficult for the company and for you. So it's just something to consider, that while you are working remotely, consider it a privilege. It's not a right. It's a privilege. If you abuse the privilege, you may lose that job. Not trying to threaten anybody. That is the reality of what could happen. We want to make sure whether you're a manager or an employee or worker, that it's a two-way street. Both sides have to be in agreement with what's good and what isn't.
Final point on this list and in this lesson, trust can be easily broken.
You know, we'll talk a lot about trust moving on, but without trust, you have nothing. And if an employer does not trust an employee, and vice versa, if employees don't trust managers, that could result in problems, not only with the job or with the people, but with upper management or other things. So it is something to consider. There could be issues with this. And that's it on this lesson. We will talk about some pros and cons later on in some more detail. But now let's move on to the next lesson.